Okay, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the component CPU and basically the basic idea of what CPU is, what do we mean by machine code instructions, and so on and so forth. This is a very long video, okay? The reason it's so long is because there's lots of information to give you. I didn't want to kind of give a summary. I wanted to actually go into detail as if this was a lesson. There are some tasks for you to get involved in as well, so please do that. It's also a good way to stop it. I wouldn't advise watching this from start to finish in one go. It's just too much. It's not designed as that kind of thing. If you want to watch it in one go, feel free. You might be falling asleep by the end of it. It does kind of give the background detail on it, so it is really designed if you missed a lesson or forgotten a lesson or just need more clarification about what a topic is, this is where you go to. If you want to revise the topic, I don't suggest using this video, okay? There's some great videos done by Craig and Dave. Google them on YouTube. They've made some great videos which I think make much better revision topics, okay? We're going to be looking at the core components of the CPU, the arithmetic and logic units, the control unit and the memory units, and we're also going to be looking at the different factors which affect performance of the CPU. So this slide is really kind of giving you a bit of an overview. Now the core purpose behind a CPU is to fetch, decode and execute machine code instructions. Now, if you've never really come across these terms before, but that might not make a lot of sense. So we're going to be looking at that in a bit more detail in this presentation. On the simplest way to explain it, fetching is essentially where we take information that's stored in the computer's memory and load it up into the CPU. Decoding it is working out what instruction we need, what instruction it is, and executing is actually running the instruction. Synchronizing and control hardware, so the CPU is responsible for making sure all the hardware is doing what it's supposed to be doing, for sending instructions to the hardware to tell it to save, load, whatever it happens to be. And it uses these things called buses in order to communicate, and all of this detail is going to be explored. But this is a nice little slide to come back to at the end of this presentation, just to kind of say, yes, I now see how it all kind of works together. Now this is a picture of a motherboard. Now I'm going to start off with understanding what the motherboard is. Now the motherboard is inside every device. Now if it's a mobile device, the motherboard's all going to be really small and integrated, and if it's going to be soldered directly onto the motherboard. In a desktop PC, you can take things in and out. So for example, you can put more memory into it, or you can swap CPUs, or you can put a new graphics card in. It really depends on the device you're using. But they all have this motherboard. And what it essentially does is allow all the different components to plug all together so they can communicate with one another, or specifically the CPU can communicate with it, because the CPU is the heart of the CPUs, of the computer. So the CPU is marked very clearly on the screen now, and this is going to be connected to the different devices. So you've got memory or RAM. So the CPU will load up the programs and the data it's currently working on from memory. Memory is really important inside a computer because what it does is it provides quick access to the programs you've loaded up or anything like that. I'll give you a more concrete example. So let's say you double click on Microsoft Word. It waits for a few minutes. You have the little blue screen come up saying, hey, I'm loading. What's happening at that moment in time is it's actually copying the program itself into RAM and then executing part of that program to basically do all the setup it needs to do. It's why it takes a long time. Then we've got other parts of the computer, such as secondary storage. Now these are going to be the drives you have in your computer. So it's going to be a hard drive, or if you've got a solid state drive, you've got loads of cache, that's what you'd have. CD drives and anything along those lines. So we call those secondary storage. These are the places where you're going to store things a bit more permanently. So for example, when I save my Word document, I'm going to be saving it onto the hard drive. If I'm loading up a program for the first time, I might be loading up from a disk I got from the shop. So it's going to be normal permanent storage. And again, the secondary storage is connected to CPU. Then we have our USBs. Now USBs are going to be where you plug in your keyboard and mouse most likely, your memory sticks, and any other kind of USB device that you might have. So these are quite more generic, so they could be anything, but these again are connected to CPU. I'm not going to go over every single device, but I'm going to go over one more because it's quite common, and that's a graphics card. Okay, a lot of desktop computers will have a graphics card. Lots of mobile computers or cheaper computers might have the graphics cards built into the actual motherboard itself. Either way, they will still have graphics, and it will still be connected to the CPU by this thing called a bus. Take away the picture and just leave the diagram, we now have an overview of how a computer might look. Okay, so every device is connected to that CPU via a bus. Okay, and the bus is essentially just a wire or part of the circuitry going between them. So you can actually physically see it if you look hard enough on the motherboard. And it's made up of 3 parts, which we're going to go over in a moment. So if you do turn over motherboard, this is most visible on desktop PCs. But if you took the motherboard out, turned it over, had a look at the underside, you'll see these kind of marks on it, and these are the connections to from the devices to the CPU, and we call them buses. So buses are really important. They send data from devices to the CPU and from the CPU to devices. So everything that is going to be done by the device is going to go over the bus. So data takes many forms in computer science. So it could be image data. So let's say I've got a graphics card and I want to currently display, I know, a picture of a monkey. That's going to be sent through the bus to the graphics card, which will then display it on the monitor. It could be a variable. So let's say I've got a computer game that I'm playing, it's got the high score. That high score is going to be stored in a variable. That variable is most likely going to be stored in RAM somewhere. So the contents of that variable needs to be sent over to RAM, i.e. it's going to go down the bus. Instructions to be executed. So remember I said when you load up a program, it's going to be stored in RAM. Well, that program still needs to get to the CPU, and it's done by sending it over a bus. So the bus is going to be sending data, and that data can take many, many different forms. Okay, I've just given you 3 examples. There are lots of different examples. Computers work by sending this data over. So when we send the data, we might be loading data up. So I might be loading up an instruction from memory into the CPU, or I might be saving it. So I might be saving the current score into a variable which is stored in RAM. Everything inside a computer is purely the clever manipulation of data. Okay, I'm not going to go really clarify that statement in too much detail, but anything you can think of, be it changing what's on the screen to typing something on the keyboard, everything is just this manipulation of ones and zeros on the computer. Okay, just very, very clever ways of doing it, but ultimately we're just sending and receiving ones and zeros. A bus is made up of 3 core parts. Okay, you can't really see that if you look at it on the motherboard, but they are there. So we've got the data bus, the address bus, and control bus. So data bus is really easy to understand because any data I'm wanting to save, I'm trying to load up from a device, say I'm loading up that instruction from memory, is going to use that data bus. The address bus is going to tell the device where to find the data. Okay, so it might be the location of where the data is going to be saved, or it might be where the data is going to be loaded up, and we call this data, the location of the data, an address. Control bus is basically the operation that needs to be performed. So a signal is going to be sent down the control bus to basically tell it, okay, I want to save, I want to load, I want you to do something. Okay, so the control bus is sending the instruction that needs to be done by the device. So as an example, just to kind of really make this clear, let's say I want to save a byte of data. Okay, I'm running the high life. I want to save the letter A, and I want to save that letter A to the hard drive. The A is going to be sent down the data bus. The actual physical binary representation of the letter A in ASCII is going to be sent down the data bus. Where I want that A to be saved on the hard drive is going to be sent by the address bus, the location of it. And the control bus is going to send the control signal to tell the hard drive, okay, you need to save this letter at that address, please. Okay, so that's kind of the roles that these 3 buses actually play. So Now's a good time to pause the video. Now I'm going to have these tasks throughout the video, so I really do advise you to just pause it because these videos are quite long. There's lots of detail on them. It's effectively a lesson in a can. So use this opportunity to actually take that time to pause, do the task. Okay? So in this task, I want you to draw the motherboard diagram out. This is really useful, especially if you've never done GCSE before. Okay, explain the purpose of each device. Again, this is really useful to kind of give you an overview because we're not necessarily going to spend a lot of time looking at the basics of computing. We make the assumption you already know. So if you don't know, now's the time to actually take a pause, work out what each device really does. Then, more specific, going down to A level, define the 3 buses and explain the purpose of each bus. You need to know exactly what each bus does. When you are making notes, please make sure you're precise in how you write it. Okay, don't just write down things like it stores stuff. Okay, because that's not precise. You're not going to get any marks in A level for saying things like that. But if I want to say, for example, the address bus is the location of where information can be stored, then that's okay. So let's move on to the next bit. Looking at the relationship between CPU and instructions. Now, one thing I found when I've been teaching this in the past is that some students get really confused about what is actually a machine code instruction. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to just pause and actually go over this in a bit of detail so you know and understand exactly what's meant by it. So we're going to focus on the interaction between RAM and the CPU. That's really what the focus of basically the CPU unit really is how instructions are loaded up. So we're going to look at how they're loaded and executed. Every program you run is made up of instructions. Okay, so these are instructions that the CPU understands. So if I have Microsoft Word again, that is made up of many lines of instructions. Okay, written by programmers, and we call these instructions machine code. Okay, so the next step really is to understand, well, what is machine code? So I know my programs are made up of instructions, and I know these instructions are machine code, but what do we mean by machine code? So, machine code is binary. Now, the computer only understands binary. It'd be lovely if the computer understood English. It just doesn't. It's not a Star Trek computer. So it understands binary only. So every instruction is binary, and it's split into 2 parts. Now, the size of an instruction is really based on the architecture of the CPU using. Now, CPUs nowadays are either 32-bit or most likely 64-bit. There's not many 32-bit computers out there anymore. Most of them are 64-bit. So that's how big one instruction is going to be. Okay, so if you have a 64-bit computer, each instruction is going to be 64-bit. Instructions, therefore, are split into 2 parts, the opcode and operands. Now, on the slide at the moment, I have got a sample instruction. So I've got an instruction which has 6 bits for the opcode and the remaining bits for the operands. Now, this would be a 16-bit instruction. It really depends on the CPU to how many bits are used for the opcode and the operand. This is an example. Okay, please don't put in your notes that opcode's always 6 bits and operand's always the rest. Okay, don't write that because that's not true. Okay, what I'm trying to represent here is that instructions are split into 2. The first few bits are going to be the opcode. The last few bits are going to be the operand. Okay. So let's really go into detail what we mean by opcode and operand. So opcodes. A CPU has a finite list of instructions, so there's only a certain number of instructions it knows about. And we call that set of instructions the instruction set. Okay, we're quite imaginative in our names. And every single instruction has a unique binary value. Okay, so every instruction we can tell each instruction apart by its binary value. Okay. There's not much point looking at what those binary values are because they're going to be different for different CPUs, and in all honesty, in order to go into that level of detail, we are starting to go into the murky world of assembly coding, and that's well and truly outside the scope of this. But for now, just accept that every single instruction has its unique binary value. And the binary value we use to represent instruction is known as the opcode. So the opcode is essentially just a binary value for an instruction. The operand, on the other hand, is the data the instruction needs to run. Now, if I was going to add a number I need to know that I want to do add, so that's going to be the opcode, and then the data I want to add, so the number I want to add will be the operand. So we call the data part of the instruction the operand, so it always has to be there. There's not many instructions out there which don't need an operand, so it's the actual data that's going to be run. However, sometimes the data is too big to be stored in the operand, okay? Because we've only got a limited amount of space. Remember that our instructions have a fixed size, maybe 32-bit, 64-bit, whatever. Maybe my data is too big to fit into that. If that's the case, we'll use a memory address instead, okay? So the operand could be the data I want to apply to the instruction, or it could be a location, a memory address of where I can find the data that I need to use for it, okay? We're going to explore that idea in a lot more detail when we look at the FD cycle, but it's really important to actually introduce it now, because just so you know that we've got two different ways of getting data for the operand. So more formally, an operand will be the data or the address of where I can find the data. So now's a good time to pause, okay? There's a lot of really important information there. That is A-level information. So I've got a question here. Describe the term machine code, 4 marks. Now, in the exam, you're going to get questions. If I'm honest, this question is not necessarily one you might get, because in A-level, the questions tend to be scenario-based. But just to begin with, we're going to have a bit more of a simple question. So when answering exam-style questions, it's really important that we're precise. So what I've done to help you, I've created a word cloud. Now, in your answer, it's important that you include each of these words, or try and include each of those words. Okay, this will help you with the precision of your answer. Okay, so good time to pause, go off, answer this question, and the next slide, I'm going to show you a model answer. Okay, so here's the model answer. First of all, you probably notice I've split my instructions into bullet points, okay? The examiners like bullet points. The reason they like bullet points is because it's really easy to mark quickly, okay? It's good for us as well, because we can write bullet points faster. Also, it helps us keep track of how many points we're making. So if I've got a 4-mark question, I know I'm going to need 4 bullet points, or I'm going to try and get 4 bullet points. So it's just a nice way of doing it. It means that I can save time in the exam, which is obviously very important. So machine code is binary, which CPU can execute as instruction. CPUs have a finite set of instructions known as the instruction set. A machine code instruction is split into operand and opcode. Opcode contains the command that needs to be run. Operand contains the data which needs to be used in the instruction. The operand could be used as an address to where the data can be found. Okay. Notice I've then highlighted all those keywords on the word cloud in orange. Okay, just to kind of show how I've used them. Okay, so I'm aware I've got a lot of bullet points here. A lot of exam questions will have mark schemes which have more than, say, 4 points. So if it's a 4-marker, it might have 6 marks available. Okay, that's purely because students might answer in different ways. So they have extra marks just in case. Okay, so what I've done here is kind of effectively given like a mark scheme instead of an answer. Anyway, exam tips. Bullet points are acceptable, okay? It saves you time and helps you keep track of how many marks you might get. Having a list of keywords for each topic really helps for creating these little word clouds. So for every topic, if you make a list of all the keywords that can come up, and then you can revise those. So when you're answering questions, say on the CPU, you know, I need to make sure I use some of these words depending on the topic. It's worth having these written separately using the Cornell method. Now, if you're not sure about the Cornell method or making notes, I'm going to summarize it really quickly just for people who I'm not teaching. The Cornell method is where you split your page into 2. The left-hand side section is going to be a lot smaller. You write down the words on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side you say what they mean. That way you can just cover up the right-hand side and you've got a quick way of checking. Okay, so it's a really quick, easy method. If you want to learn the Cornell method of note-taking, there's loads of websites on it. Now, let's move on. So, components of the CPU, there are 3 main components and registers. So the ALU, CU, and MU. We're going to be focusing on the LU specifically, but we will talk about the CU and MU as well. The ALU really is what comes up most often, and in the subject clarification document that came out recently, that's the one it was talking about. So let's spend a bit of time looking at ALU. So the arithmetic logic unit is responsible for calculations and logic. So when we say calculations, we're talking about adding, subtracting, all that kind of lovely stuff. And it could be either floating point or integer. Now, one thing to point out is that computers have different instructions to add and subtract in floating point than they do in integer division adding. To give you an example, in AS we're going to be looking at the difference between floating point in binary and say 2's complement in binary, and we're going to be looking at how to add in integer numbers. In A2 you could be looking at how to add floating point numbers. You'll see that they're very different. Okay, so that's why we have different instructions, because they're done differently. Logic operations, so greater than, less than, and or not, that kind of stuff. But the weird one, which is one that really throws people, is this idea of a conduit for input and outputs. Okay, I'm going to explain that in a moment. Just kind of throwing it out at you. The ALU does have a register which it uses exclusively, known as the accumulator, or the ACC. So the ACC is used during calculations, and the results of any calculation is always stored in the ACC. So effectively the ALU gets information from the ACC and stores information in the ACC. So conduit for input and output does seem weird, so I'm going to try and explain that in a bit more detail. So imagine I've pressed a key on the keyboard and I need that information sent over the buses. Okay, so remember my keyboard is going to be plugged in by USB. The USB is connected to the CPU by a bus. That stands for Universal Serial Bus, so it makes sense. So that key press, whichever keys I have pressed, is going to go down the data bus. When it arrives at the CPU, it's going to go straight to the accumulator, okay? Because the accumulator will store the inputs that I've just entered. By storing the accumulator, I always know exactly where it's come from, where I can find it. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. So any data that comes in via input is always going to store in the accumulator, and anything that I need to send out of the CPU is always going to be stored in the accumulator as well. So that's what we mean by conduit for input and output. Essentially, all input gets stored in the ACC, all output is going to come from the ACC, ergo the ALU is managing input and output. As I said before, arithmetic operations make use of the accumulator, but it might not always be obvious how. So here's an example of a really simple calculation, 5 plus 3 plus 2. So what would normally happen in the CPU, it would first of all load up the number 5 and store it in the accumulator. It then adds the contents of the accumulator to 3 and add 3 to it. It then adds the contents of the accumulator and add 2 to it, and then outputs the result of the accumulator to RAM, or saves it. So that's how it kind of works. So the operands of an addition instruction will only have one number, okay? Because it always uses the accumulator and adds whatever is in the operand to the accumulator. Okay, that's the kind of idea of the way it works. I know it might seem a bit odd, but that's how it works. When we study Little Man Computer, you'll see that in a lot more practical fashion, okay? So pause time. Now's the time to make some notes on the key aspects of the ALU. Okay, it's really important you understand and get detailed notes on the ALU. Make sure you explain the role of the accumulator inside the ALU, so how it's used in calculations, and also explain what we mean by conduit for input and output. The last point is really important, because most students kind of forget what we mean by it. Okay, because it's a bit of a weird one. It's not something that we're normally used to, so it's important to have notes on it. So, the memory unit is responsible for managing and fetching and storing of information in RAM. It's specifically going to manage running programs, the data currently in use, and currently running operating system. Okay, so effectively it's managing RAM. If I'm going to run a program, or if I'm going to access data, it has to be inside RAM before I can do anything with it. Okay, so the memory unit is obviously going to be responsible for kind of dealing with all that kind of stuff. The control unit manages the execution of machine code instructions. It sorts out the control signals which go in via the control bus, and also synchronises instructions by using the processor's internal clock. I'll go on to that point in a moment. It also, which is based on the clock speed and is known as a clock cycle. So a clock cycle is the time it takes to run one instruction. Or it's one instruction. So when we say synchronize, what we really mean is every clock cycle, so i.e. every instruction, will run for a specific amount of time. Okay, so a clock cycle is always the same amount of time, and that time is based on the clock speed. So for example, if I have an instruction which finishes early, well, I don't want to stop the next one off yet, because if I do that, we might have an inconsistent state. So I might not have yet fetched the next instruction to run. And if I've not fetched that next instruction and I try to run it, well, it's going to go a bit peaked on. So it's really important that we synchronize and have every instruction last the exact amount of time. Some instructions might take 2 or more clock cycles. That's fine. So we're allowed to take more clock cycles, but we're not allowed to take less time than a clock cycle. So when we say synchronizing, that's essentially what we're talking about. So this slide just has a bit of a summary. I'll let you read it just as well as I can. So all the information we just covered is in there. Okay, this is another example of how you may wish to organize your notes. Rather than having massive paragraphs of writing, use bullet points. As you can see, they're really quick and easy to read. You can then get your highlighter out and highlight keywords. It becomes much faster to revise from. Another pause opportunity. Now's the time to maybe draw a diagram of the CPU, annotating the key roles. Obviously, because you've already made notes on the LU, it's probably worth just making reference to those notes rather than actually rewriting them out. Obviously, if you want to rewrite them out, go nuts, I don't mind. Okay, I apologise, this is a very long video, but hey ho, there's a lot of information to give you. Registers are the last piece of the puzzle inside the CPU. Now, I've already kind of talked about a register already. I've said the ACC. I've said the accumulator register is storing the result calculations from the LU, and it's used by the LU to perform calculations. I've not actually told you what a register is. So now's the time to do that. So registers are temporary memory stored inside the CPU. It's actually physically inside the CPU, and they're used during execution of instructions. Okay, and they are running at the same speed as the CPU, so they're as fast as CPU. The size of a single register is based on the architecture of the CPU. So if we've got a 32-bit CPU, it's going to be 32 bits. 64-bit, it's going to be 64 bits. So we can look at a number of special purpose registers in a later presentation when we talk about the FD cycle. We've already talked about one special purpose register, which is the accumulator, but there are also some general purpose registers as well. Okay, these are going to be storing the variables that the program's going to be using in order to reduce the amount of fetching I need to do from RAM and that kind of stuff. So general purpose registers can be used by programs in any way they wish to. So we've talked about this idea of clock cycle very briefly, but we've not really talked and made it clear what we mean by clock speed. So CPUs have a speed, and that speed is measured in hertz. So a 1 hertz PC is going to perform 1 FD cycle per second. So when we say clock cycle, we mean 1 fetch, 1 decode, 1 execute cycle. A 2 hertz PC will do 2 cycles per second, and so on and so forth. So it's traditionally been a way of measuring CPU performance. It's not the best way of doing it though, and we're going to talk about that in later on this presentation. So to summarise, clock speed is the number of instructions CPU can run per second, measured in hertz. Most modern processors are measured in gigahertz rather than hertz. So gigahertz would be 1 billion hertz. The internal clock is synchronized by a clock cycle, so one instruction will only ever take one clock, well, will take one clock cycle, or maybe more than one clock cycle, but never less than. An instruction does not have to take the full cycle if it just wants it, but we can't stop that next one off until it finishes that one. Some instructions do take multiple clock cycles instead. And increasing the clock speed means more instructions can be run in the same amount of time. So if I have a higher clock speed, I can run more instructions per second. Now, it's worth maybe making a quick note about overclocking. Now, overclocking is where you increase the clock speed of a CPU beyond what the manufacturer has sold it for. So I might have bought a 2.4 gigahertz, but maybe I can overclock to 2.8. It sounds great, but there's a problem with overclocking. The faster a CPU works, the hotter it gets. So if I overclock a CPU, it's going to start to overheat. Now, I can maybe mitigate that by having maybe liquid cooling or something like that, but ultimately I need to deal with the heat. If I don't, it will become unstable, it's going to start to shut down, and in real extreme circumstances, if it can't shut down fast enough, it's going to start to burn. Now, the CPU can get to 300 degrees Celsius very quickly, okay, within a matter of seconds. So CPUs do need a lot of heat management. Overclocked CPUs become less reliable and more likely to cause crashes. So the faster I try and overclock it, the less reliable it's going to be. And also, as you probably would imagine, it's going to reduce the lifespan of the CPU. So it's not going to last as long as it would have. So now's a good time to pause. E-notes describe the difference between clock speed, clock cycle, and also what a register means. And don't forget, when you're making notes, it is all about the detail, because if you miss detail in your notes, you're going to miss it in the exam questions as well. So we're coming near the end of this long video. So the last thing we need to look at is relative speed. Okay. Now the CPU is the fastest part of the computer. Okay, it runs incredibly quickly. The problem we have though is that not every other component runs as fast. So memory is fast, but it's nowhere near as fast as the CPU. The hard drive is even slower still. So one of the problems we have is that the CPU ends up being idle for most of the time. It's waiting for for memory or the hard drive or some other device to actually do what it needs to do. We call this the von Neumann bottleneck. Now, the von Neumann architecture is something we're going to cover later, but as kind of like a brief introduction, most computers are based around the von Neumann architecture, and the bottleneck is effectively this mismatch between how fast the CPU can run and how fast all the other devices can run. And effectively, as the most simplest terms, we can only run as fast as the slowest device. So when we're loading a program, you're probably thinking, well, if I have a faster processor, does this mean that the CPU it will load faster? The answer is no, because what happens is the CPU is going to be running in bursts. So it starts off quickly saying, okay, I need to load this program, but then it has to wait for the hard drive to actually do it. It then, okay, I've got a bit more data, load this bit off, please, and then it has to wait again. So you can see the charts here, where the higher the bar, the more of the CPU is being used. It's doing it in bursts. So the CPU is effectively doing nothing for a large amount of the time. Okay, it's working in bursts. And this is what's happening all the time. So the CPU is effectively sitting on its bum doing very, very little. So we need ways of speeding up. So this is really starting to look at modern ways of improving the CPU and effectively overcoming this von Neumann bottleneck. The first and most common way is caching. Okay, so cache is a small block of memory which is really, really fast. Okay, and it's either stored inside the CPU itself or on the motherboard, or actually most computers nowadays are both. Okay, so it's going to be two caches, one on the CPU, one on the motherboard. Anything stored in cache will be accessed much faster than it will be in main memory, so in RAM. So fetching from RAM is going to be slow, but fetching from cache is going to be faster. Therefore, if I'm the amount of time I'm waiting for something to be fetched from RAM is going to be longer than the amount of time I'm going to be waiting if it's fetched from cache. So long and short of it, having stuff in cache will be a good thing. So the way cache works is quite simple. When programs are fetched from memory, they're going to be stored in cache. So when I do initial fetch from RAM, I'll store that in the cache as well. Therefore, if I need it again, I can go straight to cache. If I go to cache and the data or instruction I want to use is not inside there, we call that a cache miss. And obviously cache miss means I have to go back to RAM and it's going to take a bit longer. The reason why caching works and really speeds up the computer is because most of the time we spend 80% of our time in 20% of the instructions. So that's a very, very rough idea. But the reason for this, as a really brief overview, is loops. Okay, most of the time a program is inside a loop, and a loop has a finite set of instructions inside it. Therefore, if I copy those instructions inside the loop into cache, it means I'm continuously accessing the same instructions, maybe 10,000, 100,000 times, so it's going to speed up. So that's kind of the basic idea behind it. So because of that, we're going to have a lot less cache misses, more cache hits, ergo the whole system speeds up. So memory has speed. This is the amount of time it takes to fetch data from it. We measure the speed of memory in nanoseconds, or as a frequency, so the number of bytes per second we can get from it. The lower the time that it takes to fetch one instruction, the faster the fetch is going to occur. So cache memory is faster, so it's going to have a smaller amount of nanoseconds to transfer data. So by increasing the speed of cache, I effectively am spending less time waiting for the data to be loaded, so less idle time for the CPU, ergo increasing the performance of the. So let's actually get a quick comparison of RAM. This is just a little bit of maths to kind of play around with. So DDR4 RAM can run at 2133 megahertz or 4.7 nanoseconds for a transfer. This is compared to a CPU running at 2.8 gigahertz, which can run an instruction every 380 picoseconds or 0.28 nanoseconds. So bonkers numbers. This means that the CPU can do approximately 60 instructions for every memory fetch. So long and short of it, for every time I'm waiting for one fetch, I'm sitting idle and I could have done 16 instructions. Level 3 cache runs much faster. So for example, say for a Core i7, the cache could be running at 2.13 gigahertz or 0.47 nanoseconds. This means the CPU will be idle for less than 2 instructions, and that's a big difference. So this is kind of like a little bit of a numeric example of why cache is better. Okay, so I'm going to be spending less time idle than I would. Obviously, cache size makes a difference as well. So the larger cache, the more I can put into it, ergo the more higher chance for cache hit. And obviously every cache hit is going to reduce the amount of time the fetch takes. But cache is expensive, it's going to cost more, it takes more power to run it. So there are trade-off with increasing cache size. So we can't always have humongous amounts of cache. So cache is always going to be limited. The last kind of core idea, to pardon the pun, is cores. Okay, so another way of improving the performance of the CPU. Cores are quite simple. It allows us to have multiple instructions running at the same time. Effectively, multiple processes. So if I have a true multitasking environment like Windows, I'm going to have lots and lots and lots of different processes running at the same time. Because of that, if I have 2 cores, I can run 2 processes at the exact same time, which obviously is going to speed things up. Because normally through multitasking, what will happen is I run a bit of one program, swap it out, load up another program, run a bit of that one, then swap it out and run the original program, and I just keep going that. So the more processors I have, the more swapping I need to do, the slower my computer gets. The more cores I have, the less swapping I need to do, the more I can do in parallel, the faster my system is going to run overall. A single process, however, is not going to benefit from multiple cores unless I code it specifically to do so. So when we're talking about concurrency, specifically in A2, we're going to learn how to do that. And one of the key ways to do that is threads. I'm not going to go into detail on threads in this presentation, but if you want to, maybe have a quick look at what threads are, because that's one of the ways cores can help. But cores are effectively where I can run more than one FD cycle at once. So let's summarize the CPU. So it's made up of 3 parts: the ALU, CU, and registers, and the MU. Sorry, I missed that off on the slide. The CPU uses buses to connect to different parts of the computer. We measure the CPU speed in hertz or gigahertz in this case. Factors that impact performance. Remember, we've got the von Neumann bottleneck, so we can use cache and multiple cores to improve overall performance. So here's just a couple of little questions to get you kind of into the right idea. So describe the different components. State what the following keywords mean. So just really kind of some basic questions to get you started. And this last question, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about. Barbara has just installed a 3 GHz processor inside her desktop PC. Discuss what the 3 GHz value represents, how it impacts the speed of the computer, and why it's not the only factor in determining the overall speed of the computer. So for this question, you need to write a short essay. Later on, when we start looking at legal, moral, and ethical impacts of computer science, we'll look at how to answer these questions properly. But for now, it's good just to get yourself used to it. The bits of advice I'm going to say is make sure you've got some very key points to make. Try and relate your points back to the question, so talking about Barbara and her 3 GHz processor, and also try and apply your knowledge back to the scenario, and finally come up with some evaluation. Last slide, I've shamelessly copied this from this subject clarification document released by OCR. I just think it's worth quickly understanding exactly what you need to know for the exam. Okay, so this clarification is really used to help you understand what you need to know. So candidates need to have an understanding of the purpose and function of the core components of a processor. Candidates need to understand the role and components of the ALU. Candidates need to understand the purpose, function, and role of data address and control buses in the processor. And candidates need to understand how the performance of the CPU can be affected by many factors. Candidates need to understand how and why the performance is affected by clock speed, the number of cores, and the size, speed, and cache. Not sure that last bit makes grammatical sense, but there you go. So this is what you need to know. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope it was useful, and I hope to make some more in the future.